In early 1942, the airfield in southern Germany woke before dawn, the way it always did during the war. The ground was hard with frost, and the low mountains beyond the runway were barely visible through a thin veil of fog. Mechanics moved quietly between aircraft, their breath visible in the cold air, checking fuel lines, tapping instruments, tightening panels that had already been tightened the night before. Nothing about the morning felt dramatic. This was not a scramble, not an emergency launch, not a combat mission. It was logged as a routine transfer flight. One pilot, one aircraft, a relocation across occupied Europe that hundreds of men had already done without incident. The pilot arrived early, as he usually did. He was young by civilian standards, but in the Luftwaffe he was already considered experienced. He had flown in poor weather, over hostile territory and through mountain passes that terrified newer pilots. To the men on the tarmac, he looked calm, focused, methodical. He signed paperwork without comment and reviewed the flight plan in silence. The destination was clear. The route was familiar. The biggest obstacle was the Alps, massive, unpredictable, and unforgiving. But they were crossed every day by pilots who trusted their instruments and their training. The weather briefing was short. Cloud cover over the mountains, moderate winds at altitude, possible snow flurries. Nothing that justified canceling the flight. Still, a few of the ground crew exchanged looks. Alpine weather had a reputation for turning without warning. Clear skies could vanish in minutes. Visibility could drop to nothing. Even so, the war did not pause for caution. Aircraft were needed elsewhere, and delays rippled through the system. As the pilot prepared to board, one of the mechanics noticed a delay. The aircraft sat idle longer than expected, its engine silent while others around it began to warm up. When asked, the pilot simply nodded and said there was a small fuel calculation he wanted checked again. It was not unusual, but it stood out. The logs showed an adjustment, minor but handwritten and initialed. Enough fuel for the flight and then some. Not excessive, just careful. Shortly before departure, a senior officer approached the aircraft. The two men spoke briefly, their voices low, their faces serious. No one overheard the conversation and no record of it was ever made. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine exchange, final instructions, perhaps a reminder about the weather. But the length of the conversation and the officer's expression afterward left an impression on more than one witness. When the officer stepped away, he did not linger. He did not watch the takeoff. The engine finally roared to life. The aircraft taxied down the runway, lifted into the cold morning air, and turned toward the mountains. It was seen for less than a minute before disappearing into low cloud. That was the last confirmed sighting. The flight was expected to take several hours. When the aircraft failed to arrive at its destination on schedule, it did not immediately raise alarm. Delays were common. Weather slowed everything. Radio silence was not unusual once aircraft crossed into mountainous terrain. Controllers waited. Hours passed. Still nothing. By the end of the day, concern began to set in. Radio operators tried again. No response. Nearby airfields were contacted. No emergency landing had been reported. No crash had been seen. There was no mayday call logged anywhere along the route. The aircraft had simply vanished. Initial assumptions were practical, almost dismissive. A navigational error, perhaps. A forced landing in a remote valley. A crash into high terrain where no one would see it. The Alps were vast, and much of them were inaccessible even in peacetime. In winter, recovery efforts were nearly impossible. The war had already swallowed thousands of men without answers. One more disappearance did not stand out. A brief search was authorized. Reconnaissance aircraft flew portions of the suspected route when weather allowed. Pilots scanned snowfields and ridgelines for smoke, debris, anything unnatural against the white landscape. They found nothing. No scorch marks, no broken trees, no wreckage glittering in the sun. The mountains revealed nothing and gave no clues. As days turned into weeks, the search lost urgency. Other crises demanded attention. Aircraft were being lost daily on active fronts. Fuel and manpower were stretched thin. Files were updated, reports summarized, and the disappearance was categorized under the simplest explanation available: missing during transfer flight, presumed crash in mountainous terrain. The pilot's unit was notified. So was his family, through a carefully worded letter that offered no details and no certainty. It spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of the dangers of wartime service. It did not say where he might be. It did not say whether he suffered. It did not say whether anyone had looked long enough. Within weeks, his status was officially changed to missing in action. That designation carried a strange weight. It meant hope and hopelessness at the same time. No body, no grave, no proof of death, just absence. Among his fellow pilots, the disappearance lingered longer than it did in official records. Some replayed the morning in their minds: the delayed takeoff, the fuel adjustment, the private conversation. None of it proved anything, but together it felt unfinished. One pilot later admitted that he expected for months to hear that the aircraft had turned up somewhere unexpected, that the pilot had landed in neutral territory or been captured or diverted due to weather. But no such report ever came. The aircraft itself raised questions. It was well maintained, no known mechanical issues. The pilot had flown it before. If something had gone wrong, it would have had to happen suddenly and completely, without time for a radio call. That suggested either catastrophic failure or extreme weather. Both were possible. Neither could be confirmed. Winter deepened its grip on the Alps. Snow buried whatever might have been left behind. Even if the aircraft had crashed in plain sight, it could vanish under meters of ice in a single season. By spring, any trace would already be locked away, preserved but unreachable. The war continued to escalate. Cities burned. Front lines shifted. Entire airfields disappeared under bombing raids. Records were moved, lost, rewritten. The missing pilot's file was transferred more than once, each time becoming thinner, less detailed. By the end of the war, it consisted of little more than a name, a date, and a route that ended somewhere over the mountains. For his family, time moved differently. They waited for letters that never came. They scanned newspapers for lists of prisoners. They asked officials questions that no one could answer. Years passed, and hope faded into something quieter and heavier. Eventually, the absence became permanent. By the late 1940s, the case was effectively closed, not because it had been solved, but because there was nothing left to investigate. The Alps were still there, unchanged and unmoved by human loss. Whatever had happened in the winter of 1942 remained sealed beneath ice and snow. And yet even then the disappearance was not entirely finished. Somewhere along that route something had come down, an aircraft, a man, or both. The mountains had taken it, but they had not destroyed it. They had only hidden it. And as the years stretched into decades, that hidden truth waited in silence, frozen in place, untouched by time, waiting for a moment when the ice would finally begin to let go. As the weeks stretched into months, the disappearance lost whatever urgency it once had. The war did not allow space for prolonged uncertainty. Aircraft were going down daily over the Atlantic, the Eastern Front, North Africa. Loss became routine, documented in columns and statistics, absorbed into the machinery of conflict. A single pilot missing over the Alps no longer stood out. His absence became administrative, reduced to forms and filing codes that moved from desk to desk, as offices were evacuated and re-established under constant threat of bombing. Any search that followed was limited and imperfect. Reconnaissance flights were ordered when weather permitted, but fuel was scarce and priorities lay elsewhere. Pilots tasked with scanning mountain routes were given narrow windows and wide areas, expected to cover impossible terrain in poor visibility while avoiding enemy aircraft. The Alps offered no cooperation. Snow hid everything. Clouds clung to peaks. Valleys swallowed sound and sight. If wreckage existed, it remained invisible from the air, buried quickly under winter accumulation. Each unsuccessful flight reinforced the assumption that nothing could be found. By late 1942, the search efforts quietly ended. There was no announcement, no final report stating that all options had been exhausted. The absence of new information simply hardened into silence. The pilot's name remained on a list of the missing, one among many. His file, once handled with care, was thinned to essentials. Detailed notes were removed, transferred, or lost as offices were relocated to avoid air raids. Clerks worked under pressure, salvaging what they could as buildings burned around them. Paper was expendable, answers were not. For the pilot's family, time slowed in a different way. They received the official notice, then nothing else. No update, no follow-up. Each passing month became heavier than the last. They learned to read between lines, to recognize the language of uncertainty that governments used when there was nothing left to say. Missing in action meant no grave, no body, no certainty. It meant hope that hurt to carry and grief that could not settle. Letters were written to military offices and unanswered or returned with standardized replies. The family asked whether the aircraft might have landed somewhere unknown, whether the pilot might have been captured, whether he could still be alive. There were no records to confirm any of it. Wartime secrecy cloaked everything. Even if information existed, it was rarely shared. The Alps remained an abstraction on a map, a blank space where speculation replaced facts. As the war intensified, rumors began to circulate quietly, as they often do when official explanations are thin. Some whispered that mechanical failure was the most likely cause, that the aircraft had simply failed in the cold, thin air. Others suggested disorientation, a sudden storm, or a fatal navigational error. There were darker theories too. Defection was mentioned in hushed tones, though there was no evidence. So was the idea of a secret reassignment, a mission that never appeared in records because it was never meant to. These ideas provided temporary structure to the unknown, but none of them could be proven. The truth was simpler and more devastating. There was nothing to point in any direction, no witnesses, no debris, no radio transmission. The disappearance resisted narrative. It did not fit neatly into the stories people wanted to tell themselves about war, about heroism, sacrifice, or even tragedy with an ending. It was just a gap. By 1943 and 1944, Germany's situation worsened. Cities were reduced to rubble. Military records were destroyed deliberately to prevent capture or lost in fires and evacuations. Entire archives vanished overnight. The pilot's file survived only because it was small and unremarkable. It contained no secrets, no strategic value. It was a record of something already forgotten. When the war ended in 1945, Germany faced a reckoning unlike anything in its history. Attention turned toward survival, reconstruction, and accountability. Millions were displaced. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Families searched for loved ones across continents. In that landscape, the unresolved disappearance of a single airman from 1942 carried little weight. There were too many losses, too many unanswered questions competing for limited resources and emotional energy. The new authorities inherited fragments of old systems. Luftwaffe records were reviewed, cataloged, and often deemed incomplete or unreliable. Cases like this one were effectively frozen in time. Without new evidence, there was nothing to investigate. The designation vermist remained, a word that acknowledged absence without explaining it. The pilot's name appeared in ledgers and lists, stripped of context, no longer attached to a living memory outside his family. For those who remembered him personally, the silence was unbearable. His family marked anniversaries without milestones. There was no date of death to mourn, no place to visit. His disappearance became a permanent question mark in their lives. Over time, even they stopped asking what had happened, not because they no longer cared, but because asking led nowhere. The Alps kept their answers. Decades passed. Europe rebuilt itself. Borders shifted. Generations grew up with no memory of the war except through photographs and stories. The pilot's disappearance receded further into obscurity, mentioned only when records were reviewed or when a historian stumbled across his name in a dusty archive. To most, it meant nothing. To those who noticed it, it raised a quiet, uncomfortable curiosity. How could an aircraft simply vanish without trace? The mountains offered a practical explanation. The Alps had claimed countless climbers, soldiers, and travelers over centuries. They were vast, complex, and largely inaccessible. Glaciers moved slowly but relentlessly, burying whatever fell onto them and carrying it deeper over time. In winter, even a visible crash could be erased within days. In 1942, with limited technology and wartime constraints, the chances of locating wreckage in that environment were almost non-existent. Still, the absence gnawed at a few minds. Aviation historians later noted that even catastrophic mid-air failures often left some trace, debris scattered, fragments washed down into valleys. This case had none. That suggested either an impact in extremely remote terrain or a landing that left the aircraft largely intact. Both scenarios raised uncomfortable questions. If the plane came down relatively gently, what happened next? There were no answers, only theories layered on top of one another, each as fragile as the last. Over time, those theories faded too, leaving behind a clean, empty record. The Alps remained unmapped in any meaningful sense, their glaciers slowly shifting, holding onto whatever they had taken. By the late 20th century, the disappearance was no longer considered a mystery worth pursuing. It had become historical residue, a reminder of how easily individuals were erased during the war. And yet, buried beneath decades of snow and ice, the physical evidence still existed, untouched by memory or neglect. It waited without intention, preserved by cold, immune to the passage of time. No one knew it then, but the case was not over. It had only been paused. And as the mountains began, imperceptibly at first, to change, the silence that had protected the truth for generations was starting to weaken. Decades passed before anyone looked at the disappearance with fresh eyes. By the time historians and aviation researchers began re-examining wartime loss records in the late 20th century, the war itself had become history rather than memory. Archives that were once sealed were slowly opened. Boxes of documents, untouched for generations, were pulled from storage rooms and basements. Many files were incomplete, some barely legible, others obviously altered by haste or fear. Most missing aircrew cases blended together, identical in their lack of answers. But this one drew attention for a different reason. Not because it contained new information, but because it did not make sense. The pilot's file was thin, but what remained raised questions. Fuel calculations written in pencil did not align with standard procedures for that aircraft type. A margin note suggested a route adjustment that was never formally logged. Weather annotations were missing entirely for a flight that crossed one of the most dangerous mountain ranges in Europe during winter. These were not dramatic discoveries, but to researchers trained to notice patterns, they stood out. Small discrepancies like these often meant records were rushed, reconstructed later, or altered after the fact. In wartime, that happened constantly. Still, it suggested that the official narrative, routine transfer, presumed crash, might have been too simple. Aviation historians began reconstructing the flight as it should have been. They overlaid maps, calculated fuel consumption, estimated altitude profiles, and cross-referenced known weather conditions from nearby stations. What emerged was not a clear answer, but a narrowing of possibilities. The route placed the aircraft directly over high alpine terrain at a time of year when visibility could collapse without warning. Winter winds in the Alps were notorious for their unpredictability, creating powerful downdrafts and turbulence that early 1940s aircraft were poorly equipped to handle. Even experienced pilots could be thrown off course in seconds. Experts explained how whiteout conditions worked, how snow and cloud could erase the horizon completely, leaving pilots disoriented, unable to distinguish sky from ground. Instruments of the era were reliable but limited. Without clear visual reference, maintaining orientation required constant attention. A momentary lapse, a sudden gust, or a misread instrument could send an aircraft descending unintentionally. In the mountains, there was no room for error. theories began to shift away from catastrophic failure and toward controlled descent. If the pilot realized he was in trouble early enough, he might have attempted to glide down rather than crash outright. Snowfields and glaciers, while dangerous, offered something solid and relatively flat compared to jagged rock. Pilots were trained to seek them out as a last resort. A landing on ice could be survivable, especially if the aircraft remained largely intact. Survivability became a central question. Researchers studied similar cases from the same era, aircraft that went down in remote mountain regions, pilots who survived for hours or even days before succumbing to exposure. In some rare instances, men were rescued after extended periods, signaling from wreckage or following valleys downhill. Those stories were exceptions, but they proved survival was not impossible. The missing pilot had winter gear, emergency rations, and training. If he landed rather than crashed, he might have lived longer than anyone ever knew. But survivability theories brought their own problems. If the pilot had survived even briefly, why was there no trace? No reports from villages, no sightings, no discovered remains. The Alps were remote but not empty. Shepherds, mountaineers, and soldiers moved through them even during the war. A lone pilot stumbling out of the mountains would have been noticed. The absence of such reports suggested that if he survived the landing, he did not make it far. Attention returned to the glaciers. Unlike rockslides or forests, glaciers did not destroy evidence quickly. They preserved it. Anything that fell onto a glacier could be buried by snow, compressed into ice, and carried slowly downhill over decades. In some cases, wreckage emerged generations later, intact enough to identify. This process explained how aircraft could vanish completely, leaving no surface trace for years. Search efforts, however, remained theoretical. No official expeditions were launched. The cost was too high, the area too vast, and the likelihood of success too low. Without a precise crash location, searching the Alps was like searching an ocean without coordinates. Even modern technology offered limited help. Ground-penetrating radar struggled in uneven, ice-filled terrain. Satellite imagery revealed surface changes but not what lay beneath meters of compacted snow. The case sat at the intersection of possibility and impossibility. Everything pointed toward a glacial crash, yet nothing confirmed it. Researchers debated quietly, publishing papers that referenced the disappearance as an example rather than a case study. The pilot remained unnamed in most discussions, his story reduced to data points. Still, the tension grew around a single, stubborn question. If the aircraft came down on ice, and if glaciers preserved what they buried, then the wreckage had not been destroyed. It had only been delayed. Climate scientists began contributing to the discussion indirectly. By the early 21st century, glacial retreat across the Alps was accelerating. Ice that had been stable for centuries was thinning, receding, and exposing what it had long concealed. Mountaineers began reporting objects emerging from melting ice, old equipment, fragments of history, reminders of lives lost. Each discovery reinforced the idea that the mountains were not erasing the past, only holding it. The pilot's case resurfaced in this context. It was no longer just a historical curiosity. It became part of a larger pattern. If other wartime artifacts were reappearing, there was no reason this aircraft could not be among them. The idea was unsettling. It meant that answers might exist, frozen and intact, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Still, years passed without confirmation. No wreckage surfaced. No serial numbers matched. The disappearance remained unresolved, suspended between theory and hope. For historians, it was a reminder of the limits of research. For the pilot's descendants, it was a quiet ache, revived each time the case was mentioned. The mountains, unchanged on the surface, were slowly shifting beneath. Ice moved millimeter by millimeter, carrying whatever it held toward lower ground. The process was invisible, unstoppable, and indifferent. Somewhere within that frozen mass, something metallic waited, untouched by time, holding the final moments of a flight that never ended properly. And as the glaciers continued to retreat, The question that had haunted the case for decades grew louder and harder to ignore. If the plane went down on ice, and if the ice was now melting, then it was no longer a matter of whether the truth would surface, but when. By the early 2020s, the Alps were no longer as stable as they once seemed. Glaciers that had held their shape for centuries were thinning, shrinking, retreating year by year. What scientists described in reports was becoming visible to anyone who spent time in the mountains. Ice that had never moved in a human lifetime was suddenly pulling back, exposing layers that had been sealed since the war. With that exposure came objects that did not belong to the mountains, signs that history had been frozen in place and was now being released. Mountaineers were the first to notice. Experienced climbers began encountering unfamiliar items embedded in ice fields, rusted ammunition casings, fragments of fabric, pieces of metal too precisely shaped to be natural. In several cases, the objects were unmistakably wartime. A leather boot sole, a bent aluminum panel with rivet holes. These finds were reported quietly at first, shared within climbing circles and local alpine clubs. Most were attributed to known crash sites already documented over the years, but not all of them could be explained. Then came the report that changed everything. A pair of high-altitude climbers traversing a remote glacier rarely visited even in summer noticed something unnatural protruding from the ice wall below them. It caught light differently than stone, flat, metallic, partially exposed as if the glacier itself had pushed it forward. They photographed it from a distance, unsure what they were looking at, but aware it was not ordinary debris. The images were grainy, taken in harsh conditions, but when they circulated, they drew immediate attention. The metal appeared to be aluminum, riveted. The pattern was old, not modern. Aviation experts who saw the images recognized the construction style almost instantly. This was not a modern aircraft. It was consistent with mid-20th century military manufacturing, World War II era. Authorities were notified, and access to the area was restricted. The altitude alone made any approach dangerous. Weather conditions changed rapidly, and the glacier was unstable. Still, the implications were impossible to ignore. If an aircraft was emerging from the ice, it meant that whatever had been hidden there had survived intact for decades. A joint effort was organized involving local authorities, alpine rescue teams, and aviation archaeologists. The goal was not recovery at first, but verification. The site had to be documented carefully. Disturbing a glacier could trigger collapses or avalanches. Every movement carried risk. When conditions allowed, a small team approached the exposed section of ice. As they cleared snow and loose ice by hand, more metal appeared. A wing section emerged first, its surface warped but unmistakable. The paint was gone, stripped by time and pressure, but the structure beneath remained. Rivets held firm. Control surfaces were frozen in place, locked in the position they had been in when the aircraft came to rest. There was no sign of fire damage, no charring, no explosive fragmentation. This was not the aftermath of a violent crash. Further clearing revealed cockpit framing. The glass was long gone, shattered or ground away by the glacier's movement, but the metal supports were still there. Inside, instruments were visible, their faces clouded but intact. Dials were frozen mid-reading, needles trapped where they had stopped more than 8 decades earlier. For investigators, this was extraordinary. It was as close to a time capsule as aviation archaeology ever allowed. As the ice was removed slowly, serial numbers began to appear on interior components. They were partially preserved, etched into metal that had been shielded from erosion by layers of ice. The numbers were incomplete, but they were enough. Cross-referenced with archival records, they pointed toward a Luftwaffe aircraft type consistent with the missing pilot's last flight. The route matched. The timeline matched. The location matched the long-theorized glacial descent. For the first time in 83 years, the disappearance had a physical anchor. News of the discovery spread quickly, but the investigation moved slowly. Nothing could be rushed. Every piece of ice removed altered the stability of the site. Archaeologists worked with restraint, aware that careless excavation could destroy evidence that had survived since 1942. Each exposed section was documented in detail, measured, photographed, logged. The condition of the aircraft told its own story. The fuselage was not torn apart. The wings were damaged but largely intact. There were no signs of high-speed impact. This supported the theory of a controlled landing, or at least a controlled attempt. The pilot had not lost control entirely. He had fought the aircraft down onto the glacier, likely under extreme conditions, likely knowing the risks. What remained unanswered was the most important question of all. Where was the pilot? As the cockpit was examined, it became clear that the seat was empty. No skeletal remains, no personal effects immediately visible, no obvious blood or evidence of fatal trauma. The aircraft had not become his tomb. That realization changed the nature of the case entirely. This was no longer just a story about a crash. It was about what happened after. Investigators considered the possibilities carefully. The pilot could have survived the landing, exited the aircraft, and attempted to descend on foot. Emergency protocols of the era encouraged movement toward lower elevation when possible, but only under specific conditions. Without clear weather or knowledge of terrain, leaving the aircraft could be fatal. Staying with it could be equally dangerous. The decision would have been made under pressure, with limited information and no guarantee of rescue. The glacier had preserved the aircraft, but it had not preserved the human story. If the pilot had moved away from the wreckage, even by a short distance, his fate could have been sealed quickly. Exposure, injury, crevasses hidden beneath snow. Any one of them could have ended his life without leaving a trace. Over decades, glaciers shift, break apart, and reform. Anything not embedded deeply enough can be lost forever. Still, the absence of remains raised unsettling questions. Had he survived longer than expected? Had he attempted to walk out and failed somewhere beyond the aircraft's reach? Or was his body still there, deeper in the ice, waiting for another phase of melting? Families of missing airmen had lived with these questions for generations, but now they were no longer theoretical. The discovery transformed speculation into something tangible. There was now a place, a location, a frozen endpoint to a journey that had previously vanished into abstraction. Officials debated next steps. Recovery of the entire aircraft was deemed too dangerous and potentially destructive. Instead, selective documentation and partial extraction were planned. The goal was identification, confirmation, and preservation of evidence rather than removal. The mountains would not give up everything easily. As word spread, historians revisited old files with renewed urgency. The mismatched fuel calculations, the altered flight path, the missing weather notes, everything was re-examined in light of the physical evidence now emerging from the glacier. The pieces began to align, not into a clean resolution, but into a clearer picture of what had likely happened. The aircraft had gone down where it should not have been able to land. The pilot had managed something extraordinary under impossible conditions. And yet, his survival beyond that moment remained a mystery. The glacier had finally spoken, but it had not finished telling its story. It had revealed the machine, frozen in time, but it had not revealed the man. And as the ice continued to retreat, investigators understood that this discovery was not the end of the case. It was the beginning of its most painful chapter, where answers would come slowly, and some might never come at all. Recovery work moved forward slowly, dictated entirely by the mountain. Conditions at the site were hostile even by alpine standards. Thin air, unstable ice, and unpredictable weather limited how long teams could remain in place. Every decision had to balance the need for answers against the risk of losing evidence or lives. There was no heavy machinery. Everything was done carefully, deliberately, often by hand. What emerged from the glacier did not look like the aftermath of a crash. It looked like the end of a controlled struggle. As more of the aircraft was exposed, investigators were struck by how intact it was. The fuselage had buckled, but it had not shattered. The wings showed damage consistent with impact against snow and ice, not rock. There were no burn marks, no signs of an in-flight fire, no evidence of an explosion. Fuel lines were examined closely. They were compromised by the landing, but there was no indication they had ruptured before impact. This mattered. It meant the aircraft had not failed catastrophically in the air. The pilot had been flying it until the final seconds. Inside the cockpit, the story grew clearer and more unsettling. The control column was angled forward. Flaps were extended. The landing gear, which would normally remain retracted in mountain terrain, was partially deployed. These settings were deliberate. They reflected a pilot attempting to slow the aircraft, to stabilize it, to put it down in one piece. This was not a man surprised by sudden failure. This was a man making decisions under extreme pressure. The instrument panel told its own quiet version of events. Altitude and airspeed readings were frozen where they had last been. None suggested a steep dive or uncontrolled descent. Instead, they pointed to a shallow, managed approach, dangerous but survivable. Investigators compared these readings to known glacier landings from the era. The similarities were difficult to ignore. One detail stood out more than any other. The oxygen system remained untouched. In high-altitude emergencies, pilots often relied on supplemental oxygen instinctively. The fact that it had not been used suggested the aircraft descended quickly enough to remain within breathable altitude. It also suggested the pilot had not lost consciousness. He had been present, aware, and functioning. And then there was the seat. The pilot's seat was empty. No skeletal remains, no clothing fragments, no blood, no signs of trauma inside the cockpit. Investigators searched the immediate area around the aircraft, probing the ice with specialized equipment, scanning crevices, carefully examining snow layers nearby. Nothing. The glacier had preserved metal and machinery, but it had not preserved the man. This absence transformed the case from historical recovery into an active mystery. The most unsettling possibility became the most likely one. The pilot had survived the landing. Experts began reconstructing what those moments might have been like. Visibility over the Alps in winter could collapse without warning. A sudden wall of cloud, snow blowing horizontally, instruments becoming the only reference. Downdrafts near steep faces could pull an aircraft downward faster than engines could compensate. Faced with losing control entirely, a pilot might aim for the only surface that offered any chance at all, a glacier. Landing on ice was never taught as a safe procedure. It was a last resort. Even a controlled descent could end in injury. The aircraft might skid, tip, or break apart. But if it held together, survival was possible. The condition of this aircraft suggested that it had. What happened next was harder to determine. If the pilot exited the cockpit, it would have been because he believed remaining inside posed a greater risk than leaving. Fuel leaks, the threat of fire, worsening whether any of these could have forced the decision. Emergency doctrine at the time emphasized staying with the aircraft if rescue was possible, but that guidance assumed communication and visibility. On a glacier in a whiteout, rescue was not just unlikely, it was unimaginable. Investigators considered the pilot's training. He would have known that descending meant finding lower elevation, warmer temperatures, and eventually, human presence. Valleys offered the only chance, but glaciers are deceptive. Beneath snow can be deep crevasses, invisible until it is too late. A single misstep could end everything without leaving a trace. Exposure was another brutal reality. Even with winter gear, survival time in sub-zero alpine conditions was limited. Wind stripped heat rapidly. Snow reflected light, causing disorientation and exhaustion. A man could walk for hours and cover very little actual distance. If the pilot was injured during the landing, even slightly, that margin would shrink further. Avalanches were also a constant threat. The aircraft itself may have triggered instability in the snowpack. A small slide could bury footprints, erase paths, and cover a body completely within minutes. Over decades, such a burial would be compressed into ice, carried downhill, broken apart, or lost entirely. Still, investigators searched. The area around the wreckage was mapped carefully. Downhill routes were analyzed. Potential descent paths were identified and checked where possible. But the glacier had moved since 1942. What was once a clear slope was now fractured. Crevasses had opened and closed. Snow bridges had collapsed and reformed countless times. Any trail the pilot left was long gone. The lack of remains forced experts to confront an uncomfortable truth. Without physical evidence, certainty was impossible. The pilot could have died within minutes of leaving the aircraft or survived for hours, even days, before succumbing to the environment. He could have fallen into a crevasse that no longer existed in the same form. He could be entombed deeper in the glacier beyond reach. Or he could have been carried away entirely, his body dispersed by the slow violence of moving ice. For the pilot's family, the discovery brought a strange kind of pain. The aircraft's recovery confirmed what they had long suspected, that he had not simply vanished, that there was a place where his journey ended. But it also reopened the wound of uncertainty. Knowing he may have survived the crash meant imagining his final moments in a way they never had before. Alone, injured or exhausted, facing choices no one should have to make. Investigators documented everything they could: measurements, photographs, instrument readings, personal items found inside the aircraft, maps, fragments of equipment, objects that suggested a man who expected to complete his flight, not abandon it. Each item added weight to the story, but none answered the central question. The Alps offered no closure. They never had. As recovery work wound down, officials acknowledged the limits of what could be known. The aircraft had told its story. The glacier had released it after 83 years, but the pilot's fate remained unresolved. His disappearance had narrowed from an entire mountain range to a single, frozen location. But beyond that, the trail went cold again. The final reports reflected this uncertainty. The cause of the aircraft's loss was listed as controlled emergency landing due to adverse weather conditions. The pilot's status remained unchanged, missing in action. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The mystery was no longer abstract. It was personal, tangible. The machine had been found exactly as it was left, frozen at the moment of impact. And somewhere beyond it, whether buried deeper in ice, lost in the mountains, or erased entirely, the man who flew it was still missing. The question that lingered was no longer how the aircraft came down. It was what happened after the silence, after the engine stopped, after the cockpit opened to the cold. And as investigators prepared to close this phase of the search, they understood that the final chapter had not yet been written. The identification process was meticulous, slow, and emotionally charged. Every recovered component was cross-checked against surviving wartime records, production logs, and maintenance notes that had outlived the regime that created them. Serial numbers etched into internal frames matched a narrow batch produced in late 1941. Manufacturing marks aligned with the aircraft type assigned to the pilot's unit. Even minor modifications, small deviations made by mechanics at his home airfield, lined up with handwritten notes buried in archival files. There was no longer any reasonable doubt. After 83 years, the aircraft frozen into the glacier was formally confirmed as the one that vanished during that winter transfer flight in 1942. For investigators, it was a professional conclusion. For the pilot's family, it was something far more complicated. They were notified quietly, through official channels that had once delivered only silence. The message was careful and restrained, acknowledging the discovery, confirming the identification, and outlining what was known and what was not. The family finally had a location, a place on a map where the uncertainty narrowed to a single point high in the Alps. But what they did not have was what they had waited for across generations: a body, a grave, or a final moment they could understand. Discussions of memorialization began almost immediately. Local authorities considered whether a marker should be placed near the glacier, acknowledging both the crash and the man who never returned. Aviation historians debated preservation versus removal, weighing the historical value of the wreckage against the danger of further excavation. The aircraft, it was decided, would remain largely where it was. The mountain had held it for decades. It would continue to do so. As the case was formally updated, the language remained cautious. The cause of the aircraft's loss was now listed with greater specificity: emergency landing following adverse weather conditions over alpine terrain. The pilot's status, however, did not change: missing in action. The words carried the same weight they always had, but now they rested against physical evidence rather than pure absence. Investigators compiled their final assessments, outlining the remaining possibilities with measured restraint. One theory suggested the pilot never made it far from the aircraft. If he had exited injured or disoriented, exposure alone could have claimed him within hours. Snowfall or minor avalanches could have buried his body quickly, compressing it into the glacier where it would be carried deeper, fragmented, or dissolved by time. In that scenario, the glacier had already taken him, just as it had taken the aircraft, only more completely. Another theory focused on the terrain itself. Crevasses near the wreckage site were mapped, some visible, others concealed beneath snow bridges. A fall into one would have been sudden and final, leaving no surface trace. Over decades, shifting ice could erase any remaining evidence. This explanation aligned with many alpine disappearances, cases where experienced climbers vanished without remains ever being found. The most unsettling possibility lingered at the edge of the discussion, spoken carefully, never emphasized but impossible to ignore. The pilot may have survived long enough to walk away from the wreckage. Not far, not successfully, but far enough to vanish beyond the reach of certainty. If he descended blindly into the mountains, driven by instinct or hope, he could have covered distance before exhaustion or injury overtook him. In that case, his body might lie beyond the glacier's influence, lost among rock, snow, and time, indistinguishable from the landscape itself. No theory could be proven. No search could reasonably continue. The Alps were too vast, the passage of time too great. The investigation had reached the boundary between evidence and imagination, where facts ended and human questions began. For the family, this boundary was painful. Knowing that the aircraft had been found confirmed that the disappearance was real, not a clerical error or forgotten casualty. But knowing that the pilot's final moments might never be known created a new kind of grief. It was no longer about waiting for answers. It was about accepting that some answers would never come. Memorial discussions eventually led to a modest acknowledgement. Not a grave, but a marker recognizing the loss and the discovery. A name, a date, a reminder that someone had been there, had fought to survive, and had not returned. For those who visited the site years later, it was a quiet place. No ceremony, no resolution, just wind, ice, and the weight of an unfinished story. As the case faded from headlines, it settled into a different category than it had occupied before. It was no longer an unsolved disappearance in the abstract. The mystery had shape now: coordinates, metal frozen in ice, instruments locked in place. The machine had been recovered exactly as it was left, a record of human decision-making under impossible conditions. But the man remained missing. The Alps, which had taken so much during the war, had given back only what they chose to. They had preserved the aircraft with remarkable care, shielding it from decay, holding it intact for generations. The pilot, however, had not been afforded the same preservation. Whether claimed by cold, swallowed by ice, or lost beyond reach, his fate resisted documentation. In the end, the story did not conclude with certainty or closure. It concluded with restraint. Investigators closed their files with acknowledgement rather than answers. The family received confirmation without finality. History reclaimed a fragment of itself, but not the whole truth. The title promised a discovery, and that promise was fulfilled. A German Air Force pilot vanished in 1942. 83 years later, his plane was found frozen in the Alps. The mountains released the machine, exactly where it came to rest, silent and intact, but they did not release the man who flew it. And in that unresolved space, between metal and memory, between evidence and loss, the story remains incomplete, held open by the cold reality that some disappearances, even when partially answered, never truly end.